Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's really good to have you with us. A very happy new year to you all. As we prepare to celebrate Epiphany, the coming of the Magi, and against that backdrop, the tyranny of Herod, we're going to be thinking about what we can learn from Matthew chapter 2. But before we get started on that, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into this week's text, which comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through to 23. Matthew has just introduced the birth of Jesus, focusing primarily on Joseph and God's interaction with Joseph through the medium of dreams. That's chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. But immediately before that, in verses 1 to 17, the genealogy of Jesus has been outlined, showing it going all the way back through Joseph and so on, all the way to Abraham. So it's really grounding the genealogy of Jesus in the Jewish tradition. And we know that Matthew's is the most overtly Jewish of the four Gospels. Now, it's important to say, given the events depicted here are often mixed in with the Nativity story as commonly told, that what's described probably happened a couple of years or so after the birth of Jesus. And we think that because in verse 16 we hear that Herod ordered the slaughter of all of the boys aged under 2 years. So that implies that the Magi undertook a long journey and then perhaps had some struggle to find where Jesus was. Now we've got a wide variety of characters who appear in this story. Firstly, we've got Herod. That title could get a bit confusing because there were several of them. But in this case, we're talking about Herod the Great, who was tetrarch, was puppet ruler, by decree of Rome, of Judah from 37 through to 4 BCE. He really struggled to be accepted by Jewish people despite investing a great deal in the upgrade of the Jerusalem temple. His parents were both of Arabic origin, and that meant that he wasn't formerly from a Jewish background. And moreover, the seizing of the throne, as it was, really came about through violent conquest and at the behest of Rome. So Herod the Great's position was actually quite vulnerable. So perhaps it's not surprising that when he perceives the threat from Jesus being born, he is thrown into a fearful, tyrannical rage. So that's the baddie, as it were. That's Herod. We've also got mysterious figures, the Magi. Now that term Magi at one point was quite specific, and it was essentially something that pointed to prophetic figures from certain regions who had particular skill in interpreting dreams. But by the time we get to the birth of Jesus, it's a term that had a much looser set of meanings. It could mean, for example, astrologers or sorcerers, or even quacks and con men. It doesn't appear that the Magi were regarded as such, and we'll come back to that thought later, by Herod. But Matthew doesn't tell us a great deal about them. We tend to assume that there were 3 of them because of the gold, frankincense and myrrh, but all we know from the language that's used in Matthew's Gospel is that there was more than 1 of them. So we don't know that there were definitely 3. And moreover, we don't actually even know that they were all men. They were probably from Persia or Arabia, travelling from the east. but that's about the best we can do. I think the point in Matthew's Gospel seems to be more that they are Gentiles who are among the first to encounter and to pay homage to Jesus. In this story, we've also got passing reference to the chief priests and the scribes, who were part of the Jerusalem religious establishment based in the temple, and as we'll see, they were consulted by Herod about the birthplace of the Messiah. And last but far from least, we've got Mary and Joseph, the parents of Jesus. Mary does get more of a mention when the Magi arrive and find the Holy Family, but it's through God's interaction, as I say, through dreams with Joseph that governs much of the narrative. Now, Matthew's Gospel, as I say, was the second to be written around 75 to 80 of the Common Era to a predominantly Jewish audience and after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, something that really shapes the narrative as Matthew puts it forward. Now, as usual, there are a variety of other texts that it may be helpful to look at if you're going to make full sense of what we find here. So in a non-comprehensive list, we'll come back to others as we go through, one very important text is from Micah chapter 5 verse 2. It's the source of the quotation used by Matthew in verse 6 when talking about Bethlehem as the birthplace of Jesus. But Matthew makes a change to the text. There were Hebrew and Greek versions of the Hebrew scriptures to which Matthew would have had access. And what we find quoted here is different to both of them. It bigs up the status of Bethlehem, which was in the poorest tribe of Israel, or one of the poorest places within that land. So it description that Micah gives of it being really quite insignificant was accurate. But because it's the origin place of King David, the greatest king of Israel and one of the ancestors of Jesus, Matthew gives Bethlehem exalted status by making this change in the quotation. Matthew also adds in some content, specifically from 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 2, the reference about tending and caring for the people, again evoking the imagery of that shepherd leader, King David, who was from Bethlehem. Thinking a bit about the inclusion of the star in the story and the bringing of gifts to Jesus, we might want to look at Isaiah chapter 60, verses 3 to 6, or 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. It gives us a bit of background that Matthew might have drawn upon there. And we may also wish to look at Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, which is the source of the quotation that's used in verse 15, that highlights the irony of the Holy Family having to flee into Egypt when the Exodus had been about God's people being rescued from oppression in Egypt and brought out of it. And finally, we may want to look at Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15, which is the source of the lament that we see in verse 18 following the slaughter of the innocents. But it's actually overall quite a hopeful chapter. Now, often when one verse is quoted, there's an element of bringing in some of the other content surrounding it. So I wonder if Matthew's trying to evoke here a note of hope among the despair at the slaughter of the innocents. Either way, the chapter as a whole is about God's intervention. So God is at work even amid these trying circumstances. Now, one of the first questions that this passage throws up is about the dating of the birth of Jesus. We learn in verse 1 that the events took place while Herod was the puppet ruler of Judea. And as I say, we know that takes us from 37 through to 4 BCE. Now, that clashes with the claim that we find in Luke's Gospel, where we're told in Luke chapter 2 that when Quirinius was governor of Syria is when the Holy Family had to travel to Bethlehem for the census. But Quirinius was only in that particular role from the year 6 of the Common Era. So there's a 10-year gap that means these periods just don't overlap. So that's one question this text throws up for us. Also in verse 1, we get the figures of the Magi who are introduced to us. Now, as I say, the term magus, had specific meanings that had become much broader by Jesus' day. But when we look at verses 3 and 4, and Herod calling the chief priests and the scribes as sort of his equivalent of the Magi, of the wise men, to ask about the birthplace of the Messiah, it implies that Herod at least did not see them as quacks and charlatans. Herod took what the Magi had to say seriously. And the point, as I say, for Matthew, by being so unspecific about their origin, seems to be that they are Gentiles. They've come from far away. And when they leave the action, we're told that they went back to their own country via another road. And the lack of inclusion of their names, despite later traditions claiming to know those names, suggests that they were not known to the early church. So they do have their kind of bit part in the story and then disappear. Now, the Magi in verse 2 are kind of consulting Herod. They're looking for the location of the King of the Jews who's been born because they want to pay homage. Now, this term that's used, sometimes translated as pay homage or worship him, is used in verse 2 and in verse 11 later on when the Magi find Mary, Joseph and Jesus. And proskuneo is a deliberately ambiguous term. It can mean both of these things. It can mean pay homage, it can mean worship. But pay your respects, effectively, and worshipping are not the same thing. And I think the ambiguity that's there around what the Magi have come to do is quite deliberate. I think Matthew intends us not to be entirely sure. Now, the chief priests, when they are consulted, in verses 5 and 6, inform Herod that the birthplace of the Messiah is Bethlehem. And the quotation that's used to back that up, as I say, is from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But the bigging up of the status of Bethlehem shows a theological significance being attached to it by Matthew. So this link to King David particularly. In Luke's Gospel, it's the census which is the vehicle for getting Mary, Joseph and Jesus to Bethlehem. And we might struggle with how do we reconcile those two different narratives. But I think the key take-home is that the two Gospels that give us a birth narrative, Matthew and Luke, are consistent about Jesus having been born there in Bethlehem. Now, as if we didn't have enough uncertainty about what's going on, in verses 7 and 9, we've got this mysterious star. Now, we know that in the year 7 of the Common Era, there was a near conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. And it could be that that's the star that the Magi had seen when they decided to set out. But the way the star is depicted as behaving is physically impossible. Stars don't just hover in one place and kind of act like a guiding light, a guiding arrow. It's something that makes sense more, though, if we recognise the connection in Hebrew thought between stars and angels. And that might take us back, for example, to Exodus chapter 13, verse 21, and the people being guided by the fire of God. So there's something about a kind of the angel acting like a signpost, a guiding angel rather than a guardian angel, if you see what I mean. Herod has been greatly disturbed, as we've already heard, by what he's been told by the Magi. And he tries to trick them, we learn, in verse 8, by saying, well, when you've gone and paid homage, come back and tell me where this King of the Jews is, because I want to do the same thing. But a dream is again, as we hear in verse 12, the mechanism that is used by God to warn the Magi not to trust Herod and to ensure that Herod is not able to directly target Jesus in that way. The joy of the Magi at encountering Jesus evokes that context of Isaiah and other texts that point to the liberation of God's people through one in the line of David, finally being liberated from exile. And it's likely that the gifts that are talked about in verse 11, the gold, frankincense and myrrh, are understood more as gifts fit for a king rather than being theologically significant in some particular way. For example, myrrh was a type of incense that could be used in worship and praise, as well as in mourning. So I don't think we can necessarily make the leap ahead to looking at the crucifixion. Though, of course, many have made connections between gold as fit for a king, frankincense as being about Jesus' divine status and worship, and myrrh as being about his death on the cross. If you ever sing all the verses of We Three Kings of Orient Are, that's what you'll find. But as I say, I think the text is more arguing that these are the appropriate things to give a king, as opposed to theologically significant in other ways. And you have to ask, if the Magi knew that the Messiah was to suffer or die, why didn't they know the birthplace? Why did they need to ask Herod? Now in verses 13 to 15, this is the point at which the Magi leave the narrative, and the action then focuses more on Herod. Verses 13 through to 23 are often not included in our nativity stories. We miss them out, and perhaps that's because of their very dark character. But I think they're really important if we're going to be able to reflect in a mature way on the nature of evil and how power is dealt with and how it can corrupt. We know that God, as we already said earlier, looking at chapter 1, verses 20 to 25, interacted with Joseph through dreams. And here again, in verses 13 to 15 of chapter 2, Joseph is warned in a dream that the Holy Family need to flee in the night to Egypt for their safety. Now, as much as we've already noted the irony of fleeing to where the people of Israel had once left, it was nonetheless commonplace in the Hebrew scriptures for people to go to Egypt as a place of safety. We can see that, for example, in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 40, or in 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 26. It was a nearby neighbour, and it operated under a different ruler, a different system, so it was seen as a sensible place to go. But the quotation from Hosea 11 shows that Matthew does understand the irony of all of that. Now, from what I've already said of Herod, we need to add that he was quite Stalin-esque. He was paranoid about those closest to him, and he killed various people, even disinheriting and killing his own son and killing his wife, who he's said to have genuinely loved, because he thought that they may be trying to usurp him. So while we don't have any external record of the murder that's known as the slaughter of the innocents, it's perfectly in character for Herod to do that. One explanation put forward for the lack of corroborating text for what we find in Matthew's Gospel, put forward by Paula Gooder in her book Journey to the Manger, is that Bethlehem was a bit of a backwater and quite small. It would have had a population of at most 1,000 people. So if we're talking about the under twos, we're probably looking at about 20 children who were killed. So compared to some of the other things Herod did, it's very small scale. But the quotation that we find about weeping over the death of children shows the depth of the grief that was nonetheless engendered. It's entirely believable, as I say, that he would have committed this atrocity. And in verses 17 and 18, Matthew really captures that grief, again through drawing on the Hebrew scriptures. But as I mentioned earlier, there's this note of hope, nonetheless, of God intervening amid the trials and tribulations of Israel. So we're not to lose a sense that God is at work here. The final part of the passage, covering verses 19 to 23, again evokes the mechanism of God speaking through an angel to Joseph in dreams. And this is how Matthew gets the Holy Family from their exile in Egypt through to Nazareth, where he describes them as eventually settling. So they do end up in the same place that we find the family settling in Luke's Gospel, but again via a different mechanism. And the quotation, "He will be a Nazarene," is one that people have argued has been ripped out of context by Matthew in this particular passage. I personally think this is a case of Matthew being willing to perhaps use a little bit of creative license in how he drew on the Hebrew scriptures in order to try and illustrate God working through all that happened in the life of Jesus, these things not being accidental or just coincidences. We may struggle with that and not without some legitimate concern, I think, perhaps. But what we can agree on is that Luke and Matthew both have Jesus coming ultimately from Nazareth, and that will be central to what follows. So this text throws up a lot of things for us to think about as we begin the new year. We now turn to our questions for this week.